Welcome back to Writing While Distracted. I'm Brenda Murphy, your NeuroSpicy writing coach. And today we're going to dive into working with beta readers, developmental editors, and copy editors during the revision process, or as I like to call it, learning how to play well with others. Stay tuned while we talk about best practices while working with others to make your manuscript shine. Before we get into the tips for working with beta readers, copy editors, and developmental editors, I want to discuss an issue that many neurodivergent folks struggle with, and that's called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Also, you'll see it labeled as RSD. RSD manifests as an extreme response to perceived or actual rejection, criticism, or failure. It can lead to significant feelings of sadness, worthlessness, and anxiety. RSD can make it hard to maintain relationships and to stick with projects and pursue goals. Rejection sensitivity dysphoria can very much affect your relationships with folks you ask to review your work, like beta readers, copy editors, and developmental editors, or agents if you're submitting your manuscript for representation. If you are aware that RSD is an issue for you, you need to take some time to work out a plan to deal with those intense feelings. I'm not going to tell you to not have those feelings because you're going to have them, but having a plan in place to deal with them will do a lot to head off potential problems. I'm not a mental health professional, but I have benefited greatly from working with some to come up with strategies to cope with RSD. So do yourself a favor if you have that opportunity, or if you know this is an issue, or maybe you don't know that's an issue, but maybe it comes up with you while you're working with your beta readers, your copy editors, your developmental editors, or your potential agents. If it does, step back, assess what you're worrying about, assess what you're reacting to, and get some help with dealing with those feelings. Find someone to talk to, work out a plan, because they may not go away, but in order for you to be successful, you're going to have to develop a plan to deal with those feelings. And that goes for your personal relationships too, as well as professional relationships. So get ahead of the curve. If you know it's an issue for you, work to sort those things out before you start working with your beta readers, your developmental editors, your potential agents. Now on to discussing how to work with those people you've asked to review your manuscript. Each of those people plays a different role in the revision process. So beta readers are like your early test audience. They're the people that are going to give you feedback on the story from a reader's perspective. They'll note any confusion they have during the reading, whether or not they're emotionally engaged. And they may point out some continuity errors. Not all beta readers pick up on those, but if they do, be very grateful. They'll address pacing issues. They basically can answer questions that you have as a writer about how your work reads to a reader, which is a very different thing. Writers read differently than readers. Readers usually are reading for pleasure and enjoyment. Writers, sometimes we read for pleasure, but a lot of times we're reading books to see how they're put together so we can figure out how to do that ourselves. We also, as neurodiverse people, are really great at filling in the blanks in our own head. However, those things that are in our head don't always make it to the page. And while something may make perfect sense to you as a writer, because you know the backstory and you know all the ins and outs and details, it may not make sense to your reader. Beta readers are going to help you help your story make sense to someone who doesn't know all of those things. Now, what does a developmental editor do and how are they different? Developmental editors are professionals. They are people that you hire to focus on your manuscript from a big picture aspect, like a helicopter view. They're going to look at structure, plot holes, character development, and pacing. Their feedback should be strategic and guide you on how to make those manuscript corrections. Now, I didn't say that they would fix your manuscript. That's up to you, but their suggestions should be concrete enough that you're able to take those and interpret them and fix things in your manuscript. Say you've got a big plot hole, or they feel like you need to address the gap. Say that you don't have enough clues sprinkled in the beginning of your novel if you're writing a murder mystery for anyone to solve it if they're not you. Those are the kinds of things that a developmental editor will address. Now, what is a copy editor? A copy editor is going to zero in on your language, your grammar, style consistency, and your mechanics. Sometimes you will find copy editors that also do the work of developmental editors, and this is very, very common in small presses. They don't have two separate editors to work with you. Your copy editor may be your acquiring editor in that they're an editor that you send a manuscript to in hopes of having it published. They may function as a developmental editor in that they're going to work with you on your manuscript to get it more polished and have any of the big items fixed, structure, details, plot holes. And then they're also going to address your language. They wear many hats. It's going to depend on what your particular publishing house, if you're working with one, has as their business model. Now, if you hire an editor, if you are an indie publishing person, and you want to hire an editor, you need to be very clear on what skills they bring to the table and what you're asking them to do with your manuscript. That will solve 90% of the issues that come from confusion. Ask them if they also are functioning as a developmental editor. Also be clear about what it is you want. If you feel confident in your story, if you feel like you and your beta readers have worked out all of those structural issues and that it reads pretty well and you feel confident in that and you only want someone to look at it from a language perspective, that's where you can go with just a copy editor. But if you feel like you may need a professional to help you address some of those issues, if you don't have a writer friend that you can work with and you feel like, or maybe you don't want to burden them, or maybe you wouldn't feel comfortable, or you want someone who doesn't have any kind of an emotional investment in your work, that's one of the best reasons to hire professional people. They don't have an emotional investment in your work. It remains your work. They remain professional. You remain professional. And you sort out the things. We can be sensitive as neurodiverse people. We can be sensitive as authors and creators. We're sensitive about what we do. We care about it. Some people refer to their books as their babies. I don't in particular, but I am invested in my work. Learning to take critique. Notice I did not say criticism. Critique is something that will help you improve. Something that is a concrete action you can work on. Say, for instance, you repeatedly use the same word in your manuscript. Say that you have 400 instances of just, or that, or so. Your editor will point that out to you and say, that's too many, and you need to fix your sentences. I have a really bad habit of using the word that. In fact, it's so bad, usually at the end of my manuscript, I do a global delete of the word that, because it's easier for me to go back and put them in where they belong. It'll become painfully evident in a sentence if you need the word that, versus you have that in there and you didn't need it in the first place, that the sentence reads perfectly okay without it. So those are the kinds of things you want to keep in mind when you're choosing who to work with at what point. I work with beta readers before I send my manuscript off to be either gone over by a copy editor or to an acquiring editor. That is where I use my beta readers. Some people use beta readers in the very early stages of their manuscript. Some people send their beta readers one chapter at a time. I don't. It's going to depend on what works for you and what works for your beta reader. Now, let's talk about some best practices when working with beta readers, and I've touched on a few of those. Think of them as your first line of defense. Hopefully, they're the people that are going to pick up on those big mistakes that will totally throw your novel off. Pacing issues, plot holes, whether or not your characters are engaging. Do they like your characters? Do they hate your characters? Do they wish your characters were a little different, or do they wish something else would happen? Those are the kinds of things that you want your beta readers to bring to the table. I usually, if I have doubts about a story, sometimes I'll just take a couple of pages and I may send them off to my beta reader and say, I'm not sure about this. What do you think? And then use that information to go forward to figure out whether or not that's where I want to go with that story. It's going to depend on how closely you work with people. It's going to depend on if you have one beta reader or if you have multiple beta readers. You can have different beta readers for different things. I write romance, paranormal, and horror. Not everybody likes to read those things. So I have separate people I work with for separate books I write. I write high fantasy too. I have a different beta reader for that. If you can find people that read in your genre, want to read for you, like your style, and are willing to put the work in and actually address questions that you send to them, treasure those people. Compensate them for their time in some way if you can, give them a signed copy of the book. If you happen to be able to go meet them someplace, take them to dinner, whatever, be appreciative. They're doing this as a volunteer to help you make your work better. And that kind of service is so remarkable and so wonderful. I would not publish half the books I've published if it were not for the amazing beta readers that I work with. When I was talking about finding beta readers that read specific things, so one of the first things you want to do is make sure you find a beta reader in your genre. Okay, make sure they're familiar with the expectations so they can give you relevant feedback. You're going to want to limit the number of beta readers. Some people use some people use 5, some people use 1. I have found that 1 to 3 is a good number for me. Typically only 2 per manuscript. Otherwise, I get too much feedback and I have no idea what the heck I'm going to do with all of it. But if you get the same feedback from 2 different beta readers, pay attention to that, because that's probably something you really do need to fix if more than one person notices it. Again, it's up to you. It's your manuscript, but pay attention. These people are being very gracious and offering you their opinions. Most of them read volumes of books. They're readers. They like reading. They don't want to write themselves, although some of my beta readers are also writers. Sometimes I trade beta reading with other writers. Typically, it's not people who write in my genre, although I'll read their genre. So I do a lot of nonfiction beta reading. I will do horror beta reading. Even though I write horror, I've read enough to know whether or not I like this book and I feel like I can offer constructive criticism around horror novels. So work that out. It's a really amazing system when it works. As I said, when you're working with beta readers, be clear about what you want. Don't just send it to them and say, hey, what do you think? If you have questions like, is this character's behavior reasonable or unrealistic? Those are the kinds of questions. What did you think of this? What did you think of that? Or does this make sense to you? Those kinds of things that you personally have questions about your manuscript, you're just a little unsure or you're not confident in, make sure that you send them those questions if you have specific questions. Also, do your best to send as clean a copy as you can to your beta readers. They shouldn't have to slug through your very, very, very messy first draft. That's not what they're there for. They should be able to sit down and read it as close to book form as you can make it, because that's where you want them to help you. Now, if you're working with beta readers in the beginning part of your story, even if you're sending them a chapter to look at, do at least a basic edit before you send that to them. Most beta readers, again, work out of the goodness of their heart. So respect their time, respect their input, respect them as human beings. If you're angry over something they write back to you, don't respond in the moment. If it becomes apparent that you are not working well with your beta reader, don't be ugly about it. The writing community can be a very small community at times. And don't be ugly to anyone. Don't write a rude response. Don't. Now, if you get a beta reader that responds to you in a very cruel, unkind, unnecessarily rude way, you don't have to keep working with them. Run that through your RSD filter. Are you overreacting? It is perfectly acceptable to have a neutral party read if you've gotten an email that you think is really rude and you've gotten feedback that you don't like or you think is harsh. It is perfectly acceptable to have someone else read that, redact the beta reader's name. Don't post it in a social media forum, but contact a close friend and say, hey, I got this feedback. Do you think it's out of line? Or do you think it's harsh? Or what do you think about the tone? That kind of thing. Having someone else's eyes on things that come to you if you know you struggle with RSD is super helpful. I want you to stay open-minded about your beta readers' feedback. You ask them for help. You are not a perfect, none of us are a perfect writer. We all require a lot of help and a lot of input from other people to make our books be the best that they can be. We need that input. No one writes in isolation. And all of those people that you see that you think are amazing writers have oftentimes a huge group of people behind them helping them turn out really amazing books. And take advantage of those extra people's opinions, their suggestions, their observations to make your book shine, to make it be the best it can be for the most amount of people. Because that's what you want. You want it to appeal to a broad range of readers. Don't argue with your beta readers' feedback. You can offer an explanation if they ask a question, or if something's unclear, you can say, did you see this part here? Because sometimes beta readers are reading in a hurry. They may have missed the first part of an explanation and they have questions later, but that can be a signal to you that maybe you need to bring those things closer together so someone doesn't forget from one page to the next what's happening. But don't argue with them. There's no point in it. They have their opinion, and an opinion is something you are allowed to have. You don't have to justify it unless you're getting paid to offer a professional opinion. And most beta readers are not paid. So if that's the case, don't argue. They don't have to justify to you their opinions. You ask them for it. Listen to it. Take what works for you. If it doesn't apply or you don't agree with it, you don't have to follow it. There's nothing that says you have to follow it. But at least look at it and consider it. Don't reject it outright unless it's something that would massively change your entire story and you're not ready to do a complete rewrite. If it's not working with you and your beta reader, it's okay to move on to another beta reader. Now, a word about sensitivity readers. Sensitivity readers fall somewhere between a beta reader and a developmental editor. Beta readers are not typically paid for their work. Sensitivity readers should be compensated in some way for their time. And you employ sensitivity readers when you're writing outside your lived experience, and you want to ensure that your manuscript, to the best of your ability, is reasonable in your writing about those experiences outside your own. And this can be for anything. I have done beta reading for people who are neuroatypical. I've done beta reading for people who suffer from PTSD. I have done beta reading for people who have been, other writers writing people who've dealt with anorexia. It doesn't have to be about race, although if you are writing about someone who is outside of your community and outside of your race, it is a very good idea to have someone read over your manuscript that is part of that community. That's my suggestion. You don't have to take it, but don't be a lazy writer and rely upon stereotypes or what you've seen on television and movies to give you an idea of what any marginalized group is like. This goes for language, this goes for appearance, this goes for interpersonal relationships within that group. It's a very easy thing to make an error in writing about groups that are outside your own experience. Now, if you hire a sensitivity reader and they give you feedback on your manuscript and suggest you make changes, please listen to them. You are paying them or compensating them for their service. They also have a different experience than you do, and listen to their experience. The flip side of that is one sensitivity reader does not represent an entire group. If someone has hired me as a sensitivity reader to read their book that deals with a woman who has post-traumatic stress disorder, and they want to know if they've written about this in what is a way that truly represents the experience, and I give my opinions about how they've written it, that's based on my experience as a person dealing with that and what problems that I have and have faced with that issue. And so that's all I can offer. I can't tell you what someone who has PTSD from a different experience, what their reactions might be. I can't give you that. I can't speak for everybody with PTSD. I only know how it applies to me. And every sensitivity reader that comes to your book can only bring their own knowledge and personal experience. So remember that. And remember, if you are later criticized for something in your novel that someone else in a marginalized group thought that you didn't do a good job with, even if you had a sensitivity reader, you don't throw that up as an excuse. The best way to handle it, I've found over the years, is to say, thank you so much for taking the time to give me your feedback. That's all you have to say. You don't have to say anything else. And let it go and move on. If you've done your due diligence, if you have done the best that you've done, accept the criticism, accept the critique, move on, because you can't account for everyone, although you can do your best to try and write the best book, especially when writing about marginalized groups, that represents them. So that's all I'm going to say about sensitivity readers. It is a deep subject. I may end up doing an entire podcast on that. I have some friends that work as sensitivity readers, and I may do like a roundtable discussion or bring them on one at a time to talk about that in the future. If that's something you'd like to hear or like to have happen on the podcast, please leave me a comment down below and let me know if you'd like special podcasts just about working with sensitivity readers. Thanks. So we've gone over, I think we've exhausted the subject for beta readers. So let's move on to developmental editors. Now, developmental editors are professionals. They are typically people who've been trained as editors. They have behind them an education and experience that you can hopefully rely on to help you get your novel where it needs to be. With developmental edits, oftentimes you should be ready for big changes. I know people that have worked with editors. I know people that have worked with developmental editors that will get a 20-page or 30-page document of notes and changes that need to be made in their novel to move it forward. And that's more common if you work with an agent. You will oftentimes get 30 or 40 pages, or if you work with one of the big publishing houses. I personally have never gotten that many pages back. The publishing houses that I work with tend to make their notes within the document. I don't get a formal, huge letter that says these are the things you need to do to fix your book so we can publish it. I kind of like it that it's built into the document because it lets me address them one at a time. However, if I've gotten notes from my editor that says I need to fix some big thing, I go back and fix that big thing. And I don't argue about it with my editor, because I've worked with my one editor I have worked with for 12 years. I understand her. I trust her. She understands me. We work really well together. And so that works. If I was working with a new editor and they gave me a huge list of suggestions, again, depending on what my goals were and what I felt like was reasonable, I might question some of those. At this point in my career, as a new writer, I might not question them. It just depends on where you are. And you're going to have to read through the notes, keep an open mind, and see if the changes are going to drastically change your novel. Will it still be the story that you wanted to tell? Or if you can take those suggestions and still tell the story that you wanted to tell. And that's only something that you're going to be able to do once you get those edits. You need to, before you start, clarify your vision, at least to yourself, of what story it is that you want to tell. And make sure that your editor understands that, particularly if you are hiring the developmental editor. Now, a lot of this is going to be out of your control if you work with a publishing house. They're going to set you up with whatever editor they feel is best for you, or whoever has an open slot. And that's how it's going to roll. So you're going to have to figure out and be clear in your own mind, what kinds of things do you want in this book? What story are you telling before you start working with that editor? And you can ask for a letter. A lot of times they'll just send it to you as a letter. I like the notes in the document itself because sometimes I have moved on to the next book. I'm in the middle of writing the next book and I may not remember all the details for the books that they're editing. So for me, notes within the text or next to it, like if you have Word and you have track changes down the side, I prefer comments and notes in the text directly so I can respond to them. Every editor will have a way that they like to work. And if you've hired them, they're going to already have their way. You can request that they work differently. But again, you hired them knowing what they were doing. You can ask for a sample edit from a developmental editor. If you're hiring someone independently, ask for a sample edit. Ask for a sample of how they work. You're paying them money to help you fix your book. And as a consumer, you have every right to ask, what does this entail? What am I getting for the money? What are the deadlines? Are you going to stick to deadline? How long is this going to take you? When can I expect to get my manuscript back? And those kinds of things, working out payment, whether you are paying everything up front, which I don't recommend, whether you pay at halfway points, like if they've done half the manuscript, if you break the payments up, you're going to have to figure out what works for you and what you feel secure with in hiring people. It's best to, once you get those edits back, to ask questions about anything you don't understand. If you have a question about any of the edits or suggestions, ask them. Be clear about what they want before you do a whole bunch of work that didn't meet the criteria of what they wanted anyway. That's just a waste of everyone's time. When you get those edits back, work in stages to address them. Especially if you've gotten a long letter, if you've gotten a 30-page letter, don't try to address all those changes all at once. It will exhaust you. Be mindful of your spoon level. If you're one of those people that works with spoons, how many spoons do you have? And if you're not familiar with spoon theory, go look it up. I'm sure you'll figure it out from there. It's such a common term. I'm fairly certain everybody knows what I'm talking about. If you have to guard your energy, if you're working with a long-term disability in some fashion, break these up. For your mental health, break these edits up. It's overwhelming to get a 30-page document back that says these are all the things you need to fix in your manuscript that you've already worked so hard on. So again, RSD, rearing its ugly head, along with a healthy dose of imposter syndrome can pop up, like I'm never going to be a writer, I can't believe all these changes. If you talk to anyone who's a professional writer who has worked over any length of time, they will tell you that we've all had that time where there were so many things that they had to fix in your manuscript, they wondered whether they should just throw it in the trash and start over. Don't do that. Work to get the fixes in, but take your time doing it. Use track changes, of course, so that you always have a copy. Now, what I do when I get my edits back is I make a new document, and I label it as the edits from and whoever the edits are from that I'm working on. Because that way, I do the same thing with beta readers. Like if I get beta reader suggestions back, edits back, and they've made notes, we use track changes too, I label that document with that particular beta reader's name so that I know who gave me that feedback. Do the same with your developmental editor. Put the date on it. I save a new copy each time I work on it, so I have a progression of the edits. When all the edits are in, I make one final copy, final edits, the name of the book and the editor, and then I send it back to them, because if you're working in a publishing house, that's what's going to happen next. You may have 2 or 3 rounds of edits before it is finalized to go to be published. Trust the process. This is going to be the hardest thing to do the very first time you work with an editor, because 1, you're super excited that your book is actually going to be published. Now, for indie published folks, it's kind of a different scenario, but I imagine there's the same excitement that you're working with a professional who's going to make your book better, that is going to lead to publication. If you're working with a publishing house, it is a huge deal to know that your book is finally going to be published, because once you start working with an editor, once you've signed that contract, there are a lot of things that are out of your control, and you're going to be working on their timeline. That's something you really need to pay attention to when you are doing your revisions. Don't miss deadlines if you can help it. Now, if you get something back and the deadline is absolutely unreasonable, write back, explain why the deadline is unreasonable. Say they only give you a week to address 30 pages of edits. And you can write back and say, I'm going to need more time, and explain why. And then this is the good part. You can write back to them and say, this is unreasonable. I cannot address these in this amount of time. And then propose a new deadline. Don't just leave it open-ended and say, I need more time. I need more time to the editor might mean I need another week. To you, it might mean I need another month. So be clear in exactly how much time you're going to need. If you've had some crisis happen in your family, it can happen. If you've had some other thing happen that's going to delay you, always, always, always communicate with your editor and let them know what's going on with the deadline, what's going on with you. The worst thing you can do is miss a deadline and make them track you down. It will not endear you to any editor you're working with. So stay on top of your deadlines, work them as best you can, and ask for more time respectfully and politely. Remember, it's a business relationship. If you need more time, don't just blow it off and assume you're going to do it. So be very, very clear in how much time it's going to take you. You may not know how much time it's going to take you. Err on the side of asking for more time if you feel like you're going to need it. Now, working with copy editors, and a lot of the copy editing stuff sort of overlaps with developmental editors, was, like I said, in a small publishing house. The copy editor, developmental editor are often the same thing. Acquiring editor, and that means the editor that reads manuscripts as they come in and decides after they go through a lengthy process whether or not that this is a good fit for the publishing house and whether or not to offer you a contract. So those hats are often worn by one person. That's how it works with the publishers that I work with. The acquiring editor is the developmental editor is the copy editor. They're all the same person. So finally, working with a copy editor, if you've hired one individually, is working with a specialist. You want a copy editor that's familiar with your genre and the style guide that you're following. Now, if you are working with a publishing house, they will have their own style guide. And whether or not you like it, that is what will happen with your book. And I'll give you examples. Some houses, when you write the word T-shirt, it is spelled T-shirt. Some houses, they want you to write T-E-E-S-H-I-R-T, T-shirt. It's going to depend on their choices. It's going to depend on what that house uses. Some houses want you to write kneeled, K-N-E-E-L-E-D, or knelt, because they don't use the word knelt. It will depend on their style guide, and if you are published with that house, you will fix your manuscript. Your copy editor will make those corrections, suggestions out to the side. You will sign off on them because that's the style guide for the house. And that's what if you signed on with a publisher, that's what you signed up for. So you're not going to have a lot of that in your control. Now, if you have something that you have a request for, I don't like italics used in my documents because I had a reader tell me that italics are really hard for her. She uses text-to-speech, and italics are really hard for her text-to-speech program to understand. So with that in mind, I have reduced the use. I don't use italics in my books if I can help it, but I always have to ask because most style guides want you to put internalized dialogue in italics. They want you to use words that are outside of the language the book is being published in italics. And usually after I've asked and I'll say, can you please not do that because of these reasons, they usually will agree to that change. I've not had anybody refuse me yet. So, and again, I don't think it's all speech to text programs, but if it's even one and someone took the time to write to me and tell me that, I'd like to make my books as accessible as they can be for a wider audience of people. So that's what I have asked for. But again, I asked for it. I wasn't demanding, because you can't demand. You've signed a contract with them. They have standards. They want all their books to look a certain way. So that's how it's going to look. And those things are out of your control. You want to polish your first draft. Again, copy editors, as acquiring editors, want to know that they're working with someone who at least takes the time to make their draft be as correct as it can be. Now, they're not expecting something that looks like it's already been to a copy editor, although they'd probably be ecstatic. They expect it to be at least free of basic errors in spelling and in grammar and in spacing. If you look at any house that takes submissions and not requiring agented submissions, they will have very clearly stated how they want your manuscript to arrive to them. It will have a format. They will tell you what type to use a lot of times. They will tell you what size type they want you to use. They will tell you whether they want the manuscript in the body of the email or if they want it as a separate document. They will tell you all of those things. They will tell you if they use what kind of style guide they use. If you are writing a nonfiction article and you're submitting it to a magazine, it will tell you what style they want. Chicago manual style, APA manual style, whatever. Pay attention. The quickest way to hit the rejection pile is to not read the directions that are on the submission guidelines. And again, remember, most copy editors, most small houses work as acquiring editors. So this is your chance to make your first impression. If you don't understand something your copy editor has put in the margins of your manuscript or suggested that you do, you need to ask for clarification. And if you still don't understand, ask them to give you an example. Don't ask them to rewrite your text. That's not their job. Their job is to make suggestions or to tell you how it would be written correctly, and then you fix it. You need to be patient with copy editing. It is a very long, tedious process. They are basically looking individually at every single word in your manuscript, as well as the manuscript as a whole, at its cohesiveness. And that takes time. You can also make their job a lot easier after you've signed a contract if you have written a fantasy novel, if you have written any novel where you have made up names for people, places, and things. You need to have a list that you also send to your copy editor so that they know if you've spelled someone's name in a unique way, that is the spelling and not just a typo. Because that would be really aggravating to go through a manuscript and have them correct something that you had spelled a certain way and wanted spelled a certain way. And they corrected it because to them, it just looked like a typo. So keep that list. We talked about having that list, especially if you're writing fantasy, science fiction, paranormal, anything that you're making up names for things. Have the spelling. If it's not common words, have the spelling, have a list of spelling that you can send to your copy editor. They will love you for that because then they don't have to message you back and forth and say, well, is it 2 A's or 1 A? Or where does the Z go? Or I've seen this spelled this way and this many ways in the manuscript, 3 different ways. Which of these do you want? So save yourself some time, save them some aggravation, and send that list once you've signed your contract with the manuscript. Don't argue with your editor, especially not your acquiring editor. They chose your book because they liked it and they wanted to publish it. So remember that in all your dealings. They saw something in your manuscript that they liked and they want to publish. So they're not coming at you from a negative place. Where they are coming to you is from a place of wanting a manuscript that is polished and that best represents your publishing house. Nobody wants to publish a book that people go, oh my God, the editing in this is horrible. Nobody wants to publish that book. So remember, they come from that place. That said, they are not infallible. You may run into a situation where you've been assigned a copy editor who is not doing a particularly good job, in your opinion, with your manuscript. Some publishing houses have an option for you to contact the publisher directly and arbitrate that situation. Many do not. So you need to be prepared for that. Even if it's the worst experience of your life, you will learn something from it. I've not had that situation. I have had editors that were easy to work with, that we got along, that we understood each other, and I've really been fortunate in that way. I know people have had experiences where that's not been the case. Remember, you are in control. This is your manuscript. Even after you sign a contract, you are allowed to reject certain things, but you need to read your contract carefully, because in some situations, if there is an impasse between you and the copy editor, the publishing house manager, the owner, will be the person who decides. They most often, unless you can make a very good argument about why something should be different, may side with their copy editor because the copy editor is a professional. So that's something you need to be aware of. If you sign with a publishing house, you lose a lot of control. There are many perks, in my opinion, in that I just want to write books. I don't want to have to be responsible for all of the other things that go into self-publishing. And I've self-published some of my work, so I know what that is, what all those jobs are. At the end of the day, I just want to write books. I don't want to worry about the other stuff. I like working with editors, particularly because I struggle a lot with structure and grammar beyond basic grammar. So I appreciate my editor. That may not be the case for you. You may love the control and the work that goes into being an indie published author. And I have a lot of indie published people that I read that I love their books. I am always amazed at how well they do all of those jobs. For me, it's not a good fit for a number of reasons. Being NeuroSpicy is one of them. It's hard for me to focus sometimes and pay attention to detail and all of those things that I appreciate a good copy editor will do. So review the changes that your copy editor sends you very, very carefully. If you come to an impasse, remember, you can appeal to your publisher, but in most cases, the publisher will go with what the copy editor suggests and what their house style is. So that's a big one right there. If you're hiring a copy editor on your own, budget accordingly. They are expensive. Don't waste their time by sending them a manuscript that is full of crap that you could fix yourself. If you don't send them misspellings and basic grammar mistakes, you're wasting your money, okay? Send them as clean a copy as you can. Do the best you can do with what you have, and then trust them with the other part of it. And remember, like I said, they're expensive, so budget accordingly for that. And the biggest thing when working with any of these people, beta readers, developmental editors, and copy editors, keep a backup copy of your original manuscript someplace safe. Your hard drive and the cloud, somewhere in the cloud. I have friends that email themselves a copy of their original manuscripts because your editor may have a computer disaster. Anybody can have a computer disaster. And if the only original copy existed with them, which would be hard to imagine, but I have seen people where their computers had a disaster and they've lost all of their original copies of everything. And the only people who had original copies were their editors. But it's not the original copy anymore because the copy editor is not necessarily going to save it in its original form. They're going to save the final copy. So do yourself a favor, save those original copies in someplace safe. Make backups as you work. I work in Scrivener, which has a daily backup, which means I can always revert to the day before. If there's some kind of glitch, I back up things to the cloud, and I also have, of course, my hard drive backup. So that's my last and number one thing to tell you. If you don't do anything else, you don't take anything else away from today's podcast, back up your original manuscript. So that's going to be it for me today for best practices for working with beta readers, copy editors, and developmental editors. You want to build strong relationships with your revision team. It goes a long way to helping you create the best manuscript you can and the best possible version that you can imagine. So remember, each stage of the editing process serves a unique purpose, and embrace that journey of improvement. It can be hard, and like I said, rejection sensitivity dysphoria can really kick your butt when it comes to this kind of revision. Make a plan to address that. Make a plan for dealing with those feelings. Whether you're just starting out or you're an experienced writer, there's always room for growth. Making your next book better than the last one should be on every writer's to-do list. If you found these tips helpful, don't forget to subscribe. Please leave me a review. It really helps to get the podcast in front of more people. So until next time, keep writing, keep revising, and take care of yourself. Thanks for tuning in to Writing While Distracted, where we navigate the winding roads of creativity amidst the chaos of distraction. If you've enjoyed this podcast and found it useful, share it and tag me. DM me and let me know what you found to be the most helpful. Please leave a review. It really helps get the podcast in front of more folks. Remember, in the dance between focus and diversion, every stumble is a step closer to mastering the art of writing. Join us next time as we continue to unravel the mysteries of the writer's mind. Until then, keep writing, keep wandering, and embrace the distractions that fuel your creativity. Stay tuned, stay inspired.